I am here with Gareth Russell, author of The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic, and the End of the Edwardian Era. Also host of Single Malt History with Gareth Russell, an amazing podcast. And I just want to say thank you for joining us today, first off.
Such a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. I will just jump in because obviously concise is the rule of the day and we want to get to the films, but I have a lot to ask you about. So first, in the long era of Jack and Rose, James Cameron, this 1997 film that we're so familiar with, have we perhaps over romanticized the sinking? And if so, why does that make going back to watch some of these other films really important, do you think?
Well, I suppose the answer from a historian's annoying perspective is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that obviously the James Cameron movie is a romantic movie. It's Romeo and Juliet at sea. I've told you before, it's no secret, I find Jack and Rose quite uninteresting. I actually find Rose
Yes.
totally insufferable.
Yes, we have discussed that. Yes.
So, however, I think it's important to note that we as a culture in the history of art and literature have put romantic couples at the center of big events throughout the past. How we write about major historical events is often to put star-crossed lovers at the center of those galaxies of historically important events. So Jack and Rose, in that sense, they're nothing new, but they are, I think, important. Certainly when you look at that set for James Cameron's Titanic that is so detailed and so accurate and used a lot of the original blueprints, sometimes you're hoping to see a little bit more of the wider historical context. And if you look at that movie, I think sometimes that's what James Cameron wanted to do too. There's times it goes off to look at the wider experience of survivors and victims of the Titanic. But ultimately, I think Jack and Rose brought a lot of people to the Titanic story. And there has been a fascination for the 109, 110, by this point now 111 years by the time this goes out. I think it is 111 if my math is
111.
111.
Yeah.
Thank you. Math not a strong point. So it's been for the 11 decades since the Titanic sank. There has been a sustained but fluctuating interest in it, and I think the modern sort of super surge of interest in the Titanic is a testament to the power of the Jack and Rose story bringing people in. So I've no quarrel with that. And also, I don't want to be one of those historians who sort of curmudgeonly about people having fun and enjoying a good romance. But I think we can know what it can also do in the same way it's brought people to the Titanic story who otherwise mightn't have been overly interested in it. It has brought us to this wealth of films that have gone before it. It's made people interested in things like SOS Titanic. That's so far one of the few films I believe that has shown a really sustained storyline taking place in second class, which I often say is the forgotten section of the Titanic. It's brought people back to the 1953, I believe, movie with Barbara Stanwyck, Titanic, that gorgeous movie A Night to Remember. And also it's brought people to more sinister elements of the Titanic story, like realizing that it was used in anti-British and anti-American propaganda by the Nazis. So what Jack and Rose have done is brought us to the Titanic, but also brought us to the other ghosts of the Titanic in popular culture. So they might not be everyone's cup of tea. They're maybe not mine, but certainly you can't argue with the buffet they've brought us all to.
It's so true. And you put it so well, and I couldn't even add anything to that. I obviously am a super fan of the movie. Nobody is surprised by that. That's very well known. But I agree. I think we sort of meet in the middle there. I think that the amount of people that story has brought to Titanic is invaluable. So yes, if any themes that you've noticed throughout, in a lot of these films,
Yeah.
and then why do you think filmmakers are obsessed with piecing that together through so many decades?
One of the interesting themes is that there is a sustaining of a very particular narrative that favors the dead over the survivors. That is one thing that I think tends to continue. And in particular, you will see this from the presentation of Ismay. So what happens is there is a kind of devil-angel dichotomy put with Ismay versus Captain Smith. That does actually, not always, I should say. The British movie A Night to Remember is softer on Ismay and not harsh on Captain Smith, but it does, I think, there's a lunch scene, I think, in the first class dining saloon where Ismay actually asks Smith about an ice warning and says, "Is it serious?" And Smith says, "Oh, don't worry, we'll keep a sharp lookout." That's one of the movies that shows Ismay in a more sympathetic light, and I would say probably more realistic, that it shows him below the captain and the chain of command. The sea is not a place where um, managing directors or CEOs, whatever word we would use for that today, would have had primacy over the captain. But generally speaking, we see a version of Ismay who is a sort of cross between a megalomaniac and a moron, and someone who is pushing and pushing for speed. And Smith as almost a martyr to his own gentleness, who goes along with that decision, but is not held accountable for it. And I think it's because Smith died and Ismay lived. And so, in some sense, we are replicating what the Edwardians did. You know, famously, the Hearst owned press in America changed Ismay's name in their coverage from J. Bruce Ismay to J. Brute Ismay, and the British very much, pushed and believed this narrative of Smith as almost a martyr to Britain's seagoing nobility and prowess. And so I think in that sense, we are perpetuating a narrative that started in 1912. Ismay is the real villain, though, originates in the Nazi movie of 1943. They push him as sort of the living embodiment of all that's wrong with Britain and America. And that has continued in a lot of movies. So I think Ismay bad, Smith good is an enduring trope. I also think, to your point about recreating the minutiae, I think there is a deep human need to understand disasters, partly to honor the victims and what they went through, but also I think maybe there's an unconscious desire to assure ourselves that we wouldn't make the same mistakes. If you can pinpoint where it all went wrong, can you maybe lull yourself into the false security that it won't happen again, or you wouldn't make that mistake? And I made this point in the book. I think that the chilling thing about the Titanic is actually it really shouldn't have happened. That there were that for the Titanic to hit that iceberg, a lot of things had to go wrong to lead up to it. It wasn't any one decision. But we're always looking for things, these sort of quite suspect theories, like dodgy steel, rudder, rivets. We were always looking for something to say. That was the problem. That was the mistake. Because the truth, the really chilling truth, is the Titanic was the best made ship for the technologies in 1912. They followed all the rules. They exceeded some of the safety rules. The only thing that Smith did that was questionable was that he didn't slow down when he got those ice warnings. But even then, a lot of captains didn't. They raced through ice fields, which seems incredible yesterday. They only slowed big ships down for fog before 1912, which to me is mind-blowing, but the past is a foreign country, as they say. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, and all of a sudden it is the best built ship available for 1912, and they followed all the rules, then I think it becomes a much, much more frightening story, because it's telling you you can do everything right, then you can follow all the rules, and a disaster on this scale can still overtake you. So I think there is a fascination in trying to find a way to unconsciously soothe ourselves into saying, if we avoid their mistake, it won't happen again. But things like the Titanic will happen again. It is unfortunate that catastrophe is part of the human historical experience. And if nature hurls itself against us, we will lose.
It's one of the only constants in the world, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And in my podcast, this is a lot of what I focus on, the tiny little human moment and surgically going in there. I think it's therapy. I think it helps to soothe us all. But I also think that you're right. I think that there is a constant need to reconstruct those moments, because if we find that one fault line, if we find that one little crack, then maybe we could, quote unquote, solve this whole thing. And then it wasn't just, as you said, just a series of little catastrophes that led to a huge one. And it was a very organic experience because catastrophe is a very organic experience,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
also a frightening one.
Of
Absolutely.
course it is.
Your book stands as one of the most important recent works of Titanic history because you did fresh, original academic research. On your podcast, you do the same. In all of your books, you do the same. And one of the films we're showing, The Six, has done that as well. Fresh archival research, new research. How important is that moving forward in the Titanic community for authors, for readers, for filmmakers? What role does that component play in the Titanic community moving forward and how we present these stories?
That's such a great question, and I think the answer is probably threefold, which makes me sound faintly like the riddle of the Sphinx. But I think if I was to go through, the first answer is selfish, which is, for a historian personally, it's important because A, it's your job, but B, also it's incredibly intellectually and emotionally rewarding to throw yourself into proper research because you're engaging with this subject in a new and fresh way, and it keeps the hours and the days and the weeks in which you are ostensibly alone, but really you are in the company of the past. It keeps it engaging and exciting. The other point I would say is morally, which is, I think, like the documentary makers and myself, we are making a living out of the dead, and I think we should be cognizant of our debt to them. And what I mean by that, by meaning we should be cognizant of our debt to them, is we owe the dead honesty. And so if there are things in archives, be they state, national, collegiate, or as was the case, a lot of the Ship of Dreams research I did private, a lot of the stuff was still in private collections as well. If it is there, you have a responsibility to try your level best. It won't always be possible, but to try your level best to find it out, to honor the truth about the people you're writing. And sometimes that truth is very unpleasant, but you owe it to the past to tell the truth. And the third, ultimately, I think is, I suppose, intellectually, it's for your readers. Because what you're doing is you're telling a new story and you're offering the readers who are, maybe going to be parting with their money to buy your book and their time as well. If someone is going to be giving you their money and their time, you should be giving them the best that you can. And if you can find out a new component to this story, then that's brilliant. That's wonderful. You are telling a new part of history to someone who's been kind enough to take the time to pick up something that you've put pen to paper for. So those are the three reasons I would say it's so important.
And it's so refreshing to see with your work with so many people. It is happening in the Titanic community, and for something that people all over the world continue to obsess about, it's so important to make sure that this new research is infusing everything. And if you don't mind, I know we had, and I can edit some of this out. If you don't mind, I had one more question on the fly to throw at you. Just in terms of it's a pretty simple one, but in terms of thinking about specifically the 1943 Nazi film. This is the question that has circled around, every interview I've done around this film festival, talking about it. It's so hard to reconcile the origins of that movie with watching it, and you write about this in your book, and you've studied it as well. How do we, and what is the historical value in going back to watch it, do you think? If you had just a pretty simple answer for that. I'm just curious as to your general thoughts on that.
You don't, really, is the answer. I think ultimately you are watching a movie that was very deliberately a machine-made piece of propaganda. And part of the lesson that you can take from this is that Nazi propaganda, it wasn't all like the Leni Riefenstahl films. It wasn't all incredibly obvious, like draped in swastikas. This was a series, the Titanic movie was a series of costume dramas that they made about eras in British history. And the three things that they picked were the rivalry between Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth I, the Boer War, and the Irish struggle for independence from Britain. these were not areas that you would necessarily think the Nazis would be going into, and not necessarily on the side that you would think they were going into. There was, and in the same way with Titanic, they drape it in emotion and sentiment. The anti-British and anti-American component of the Titanic film, which is what marks Titanic out different from the Boer movie, the American of Scots movie, and the Irish Independence movie, is that this is both anti-British and anti-American, because by this point, America had entered the Second World War. It is much more subtle and insidious and deadly and beautiful to look at than a lot of what we expect the Nazi movies to look at. So, on the one hand, if you're someone who's interested in the history of thought manipulation, societal manipulation, you can maybe look at not just the Titanic, but those movies that came out of Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda in the Third Reich, and see that sometimes propaganda can be much more intelligent than we think it is. And it can be much more subtle. And that, again, is more chilling. The other thing is that we can, I think, sometimes pick out some tropes that endure in Titanic movies that come from that movie, and maybe start to ask, why on earth are they still appearing? It's a little surprising that, apart from the fictional German officer, there's a lot in that Nazi movie that has influenced movies that came after it, a worrying amount of
Yes.
plot lines.
Yes, in fact,
Yeah,
was just talking with about this with someone the other day, that a lot of the theme, there's a blue diamond in the movie I mean, that is a direct, I mean, there are
yeah.
several plot lines even specifically that are a direct line to James Cameron's Titanic, which is astounding. But
Well,
I mean, the parallels are there. Yeah,
yeah.
it's crazy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Ismay storyline is almost the Ismay move. The Ismay storyline originates there,
Hmm.
and I think this idea that it was racing across the Atlantic to break a speed record, that comes from that movie. I mean, there's a lot that really originates there. But what I would also say we can look at it for is, we can look at the ways in which the idea of putting a fictional character into the Titanic story, that's not new. That's been there for a while. So you're looking at something on the one hand that is sort of just part of this, to go back to our first question, romanticizing of the Titanic story. But specifically with that 1943 movie, you are looking at the insidious camouflage of propaganda, and that's what that movie is. So you can ultimately, I suppose, you can't nor should you reconcile it. You actually should be going into it, I think, very cognizant of the metaphorical iceberg, not to stretch it too far, but that right at the heart of this, which is, what was the intention of this movie? And it was to present Britain as arrogant and unfeeling, and America as greedy and incompetent. That was the way it was intended to do. And then they insert a German, what the Nazi ministry would have called Aryan officer, in the middle, who rushes through a corridor to save a child who's been abandoned by her family. So it really is about rinsing Britain and America as decadent, lacking in nobility and strength, somehow being weak, feeble, effeminate, but malign. All of these things are woven in. So actually, I think you should be prepared to look at this and see it for the cleverly pieced together moral horror show that it was intended to be.
And I love your point about it being, it truly is the most dangerous type of
Of course it is.
propaganda. And the prettiest is the most dangerous. And I think
Of course it
as a
is.
line of analysis, and everyone, heading into watching this film particularly,
Yeah.
it's a must. It's a must to have those lines kind of marked in your head and understand where it
Of
fits into the broader historical narrative of those
Of
propaganda
course
films.
it is.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, certainly I can tell you that there are medievalist historians who, my postgraduate was medieval history, and I can tell you that there are very real concerns among some medievalists that Braveheart did that. That Braveheart had an enormous impact
Oh.
on how
Hmm.
people in Scotland and around the world saw the story of Scotland and England. And I mean, I should point out, I think Edward the First was a moral horror show, to use that phrase again. But
Hmm.
it certainly, a lot of people think it created a narrative in which England had conquered Scotland. And that it was so beautifully done that it created a myth that has endured beyond the film. So, in that sense, it is that there are movies, when they deal with national identity, they can, if they are well done enough, which, if they are well written, well directed, I think often well
Executed. Yeah.
costumed. Yeah, I think the
Mm.
look, the aesthetic is a big,
Hmm.
big part of it. And we've had discussions, just to sort of circle back to romance being a big glue. We're having a big discussion about Gone with the Wind. We're having a lot of discussions about movies that ostensibly are romance movies, but also can create a sense of the past that some people strongly disagree with. So I think Braveheart is obviously less maligned version than the 1943 Titanic. But without a shadow of a doubt, movies can, if they are well executed enough, they can create an emotional response that bleeds into how you see history and politics. I think fascism relies on that sense of the theatrical to seduce people emotionally into following it. And certainly, if you look at this 1943 movie, as you say, turn the sound off and it looks absolutely gorgeous. That's the point. That's the danger of that movie.
100%. Well, thank you so much, Gareth. I wish we had time for 10 more questions. It's always so lovely to
Oh,
speak
thank
with
you.
you. And again, to viewers that are heading into this film festival, Gareth's book Ship of Dreams got a little blurry right there. There we go. I cannot recommend enough if you haven't read it yet. It's a great companion to watching these films, to thinking about Titanic research and its role in studying the ship and moving our study of the ship further and further. And it's so important, as you said, to keep all of this fresh and original, and it is in service of every life lost on the ship, everybody who is on board the ship, to tell these stories in the most accurate and well-researched ways. So it's just a delight to get to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. You too. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.